هذا وكان. وأقول له يا سيدي لا يقصرش، يوريني حنت يديه ولا عليك. You can't be more polite than this. What did this immigration system say again? You miss one day in your status, you. A perfect word in every aspect. What a sight. When you're in a war mode, you must even forget that you even come to sleep and rest at night. Saving my words for the right time. Full stop. I'm talking with my friends now and colleagues regarding important topics. I don't have time to waste with these kids. I will let you know every time something happens, of course. I didn't start this. I'm a peaceful person, solution oriented, by witnesses from all over the world, but I'm not left any choice but to act to end this. I'm not accepting any negotiation attitude at this point, which will not happen anyways, but I don't care about the second point. These people just know how to add oil, which is COVID, on fire. This is why whatever the United Nations does in this context of action won't make any sense as long as there are people like that. It should be called the United Nations of the world, but the United States. Trump, a guy who gave up when he realized he can't do anything regarding the until it's not fixed situation. And then the diversion started. I'm not giving up. With that being said, I have to sacrifice many things until this stuff is shut down. You know exactly what I'm talking about. That it does make sense to you. I believe so. The cost of immigrating. Le style c'est l'homme. This is what King Hassan II said before. It doesn't feel right, but it's a great honor to follow guidelines from the Moroccan royal family. You know, psychological profiles that are fine in other countries do not necessarily work in this perfect world. Be my guest. That's what I'm telling them, sorry. One more word, and then we can talk about adult topics. You wanna go over my head? Insult me? My intelligence? I am the only one who's going to suffer. Just follow your logic. The COVID-19 war. One who thinks it's unifying the world. One would think this should be the only focus of the world today. I spoke prior about the complexity of the human problem, no need to repeat it. Thinking of critical situations all over the world in India, Brazil, France, Turkey, Russia. As I have foreseen, a deadly wave in India and its neighbors is leading this war to the third wave, which could span from the summer to the fall of 2021. I am interested also to read a book that I found on Gates Notes, the blog of Bill Gates, entitled An Elegant Defense, the Extraordinary New Science of the Immune System, since we're speaking about the pandemic. Right now I'm reading this book, Source of Making of the West, like it will help maybe a little bit still, peoples and cultures. It's me who has to read it, right? Anyways, I think the sharing of Bill Gates is a very insightful one and brings perspectives for the future. I also try actually to organize all my shelf right now, getting rid of so many books that are non-career related. Preparing September 2021-2022 from now, the third year of this unfortunate war. Unlike the world wars, The enemy is one, common, the virus. It's not belligerents versus each other. Getting back to a short summary regarding the EUCTR conference on European counterterrorism, focusing on the analysis of terrorism landscape, that was a very constructive focus today on terrorism and resilience, evolving trends and responses in terrorism financing, recidivism and radicalization, gender, toxic masculinities, and VERLT. This center is named for France's Jean Monnet, who works with Austria's Coudeneuve Kalergi, who is Austrian Japanese actually, to build the initial steps of the European Union. Always in counterterrorism, more global at the UN this time, I commend the work around the call for video contributions related to firearms protocol as the program of action of small arms turns 20. This concerns law enforcement services, government entities requiring key remaining challenges in countering the illicit trafficking of small arms. The Holocaust at the United Nations continue. As you know, it has been a rich discussion during the winter of 2021. Right now, I want to go back in order to speak about an important topic in this matter. Getting back to the research trend related to experts on history of the Holocaust education, anti-Semitism, and freedom of expression gathered on the gathering of the UN and the UNESCO Advisory Group meeting on Holocaust denial and distortion. UNESCO and the Holocaust and the United Nations Outreach Program, with the support of the World Jewish Congress, are developing research, guidance, and resources to strengthen educational responses to Holocaust denial and distortion. These tools aims, of course, to promote historical literacy and to prevent anti-Semitism by building individual capacity to distinguish the irreducible facts of the Holocaust from attempts to distort its history. The project, of course, aims to map and raise awareness of contemporary trends of the Holocaust, denial and distortion, and to strengthen educational approaches, pedagogies, and good practices that help counter its transmission online and in society. So, among the main ideas I can share in this context of action comes the question related to the difference between Holocaust denial and distortion. Holocaust denial seeks to negate established facts about the genocide of the Jews by the Nazis and their collaborators during the Second World War. Denial takes various forms, including claims that there was no centralized plan for the mass murder of Europe Jews, no mass killing program, no death camp or gas chambers, and that those Jews who lose their lives were simply casualties of war, as were millions of others, which is contradicted by many Jews who fly to Germany under duress during that time, coming eventually to the United States back then. Holocaust distortion does not deny the news and their collaborators sought to murder the Jews of Europe, but still it significantly misrepresents the historical record. For example, the numbers of victims might be grossly underestimated. The number of helpers and rescuers were inflated. Difficult parts of a country's own national history might be overlooked or omitted, for example, holding only Hitler and the leading Nazis responsible, downplaying the role of collaborators and the widespread complicity of many ordinary people in the genocide. In this matter, I want to talk about this in German, just to add this to my German listeners. This is coming from the House of Anne Frank, and it explains a little bit in a small paragraph how Hitler's responsibility is big, but that there was also a historical background to this. Hitlers Antisemitismus, warum hasste die Juden? Antisemitismus spielen eine große Rolle im Denken von Adolf Hitler und in der Nazi-Ideologie. Hier ist zu lesen, wie Hitlers Judenfeindlichkeit, Einstein und Walcherroch sein Lebenslauf dabei spielte. Also, Antisemitismus und Jahrhunderte Phänomen. Judenfeindlichkeit ist keine Erfindung Hitlers. Natürlich, schon seit dem Mittelalter waren Juden in Europa Opfer von Diskriminierung und Verfolgung. Oft waren religiöse Gründe ein Vorwand dafür. Christen sahen im jüdischen Glauben eine Abweichung, die bekämpft werden müsse. Juden würden manchmal gezwungen, zum Christen überzutreten, oder sie durften bestimmt Beruf nicht ausüben. Im 19. Jahrhundert spielte Religion eine weniger große Rolle. An ihre Stelle traten Auffassungen über Unterschiede zwischen Rassen und Völkern. Der Wohlverstellungskampf auf, dass Juden zu einem anderen Volk gehörten als zum Beispiel die Deutschen, selbst wenn Juden zum Christenglauben übergetreten waren. Ganz richtig galten sie als anders wegen ihrer Abstammung. Vielen Dank and forgive my poor German once again. So, when we speak about the importance of countering the Holocaust distortion and why is it dangerous, online misinformation should always be countered. One critical problem in the misinformation landscape is the idea of data deficits, areas where there simply any good information, there is misinformation flourishing. For example, at the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic war, there was the little accurate information about how deadly the disease was. This allowed misinformation to fill the gap with a lot of wild speculation. If we leave misinformation unchallenged, then it has the potential to continue to mislead others. The Holocaust was first and foremost a disaster for its victims, but it was also a catastrophe for what we like to call Western civilizations in countries across Europe. People everywhere became complicit in the murder of their neighbors. If we fail to confront this traumatic past, then we cannot understand the deep flaws of our modern world in our social and economic relations. Our beliefs and value systems and the weaknesses in political institutions that allowed Europe to descend into mass violence is an important thing and an important question to go on. It's very urgent and vital, and the distortions of the Holocaust prevent us from a full knocking of the difficult past, one that could lead to greater understanding of the causes and warning signs of genocide, and that might help us to strengthen efforts at genocide prevention. How to counter distortion? Countering misinformation isn't easy. Education and media information literacy are one part of the content and the puzzle. And UNESCO has already made some great tools available in this matter. Holding platforms accountable for the content they host is another important step. The Think Before Sharing campaign empowers individuals to respond when they encounter the type of content online. For example, most social platforms have lots of tools for reporting dangerous or offensive content, but very few people make us use of that matter. Museums, memorials, public commemoration, school, university education all can contribute to public understanding of the past, but it is imperative that the representations of the Holocaust in such institutions is well informed by academic historical research and that they remain independent of political interference. Even then, such representations are in competition with other ways in which the past is encountered in the present through social discourse, including with family, with friends, the pronouncements of politicians and leaders of popular movements, could influence, but like I said, we're not here to do politics. In media representation, like film, television, radio, and even more so on the internet and social media, and given the proliferation of this public discourse about the past, it is important not only that educational initiatives are factually well informed, but that they also provide space from critical reflection on the wider public conversation and provide critical thinking skills, for example, in how to handle evidence and how to weigh truth claims. There is a support to member states and educational stakeholders in implementing effective Holocaust education programs that promote the skills and competencies of global citizenship. How do misinformation, disinformation, and hate speech spread on social media in this context of action? There are a lot of ways that this type of content spread, but we can talk about some general patterns. Firstly, lots of misinformation and hate speech is based on websites which host the contents. This content is then shared on social media. The most impactful pieces of contents are shared in large venues through platforms and websites, and then spread from there. The initial seeding by highly impactful accounts is really important in terms of content which is widely distributed. As a moral touchstone, the Holocaust suffuses much of our public and political discourses in an age of relativism. It has become a rhetorical anchor, mooring any number of disparate positions with the same recurring symbol of absolute evil employed as such as a motif. The Holocaust is often distorted, oversimplified, and emptied of its historical issue in the service of any matter of political, social, and moral agendas. Since 1945, advocates of military intervention in Cambodia, Rwanda, Bosnia, Kosovo, and Iraq are raised in the specter of the Holocaust and its death camps to rally support to their cause. It is regrettably common for prominent politicians across the political spectrum to be likened to Hitler by those who disagree strongly with their views and policies. With the resurgence of nationalist sentiments across Europe, political leaders and factions have increasingly sought up to control the narrative of the Holocaust to present their country in a more positive light. Most important thing when we want to speak about the importance to map Holocaust denial and distortion online, and what does the study basically hope to achieve. I think that often shining a light on the scale of scope of problematic content is half the battle with disinformation in public domain. It's much easier to pressure both platforms and government to act. However, it's also really important to understand more about dissemination patterns. One really big problem with online harms is that we are largely operating in a reactive way. We remove things only after they have become really widespread and potentially already done some damage. Our project here is to focus basically on shedding lights within the context of counterterrorism, on distribution of mechanism, and help understanding more about how to tackle problems before they really get widespread. So there is also an issue regarding the matter of the Holocaust and the denial of the events that have harmed many Jews in the World War II. I want to come back here to speak about an examination and analysis of the phenomenon of contemporary anti-Semitism in political discourse of five major Western European countries: Germany, France, the UK, Spain, and Ireland, and its research that was based on a systematic mapping of public expression of anti-Semitism by elected officials over a period of 1 year from late 2019 to late 2020. The finding indicate that some politicians in Western Europe on both the right and the left deliberately and maliciously use anti Semitic ideas and expressions for political gains. This can be seen in the context of the increasing strength of extremism and populist parties on both sides of the political spectrum, which have contaminated the political and public discourse with anti Semitic statements and attitudes. Indeed, the present analysis indicates that the scale is tipping toward those who espouse anti Semitism and away from those who try to moderate it, particularly given the process of socio political radicalization, growing polarization, and the rise of once marginalized extremists at the expense of moderate center. These processes have been accelerated by social media, which has been exploited to spread hateful content almost without any significant limits, at least for the time being. All this has contributed to anti Semitism increasingly becoming part of the political mainstream. The politicization of anti Semitism as a means for political rivals to attack one another, and the appearance of cracks in the broad consensus, both to preserve the memory of the Holocaust and the fight against anti Semitism. And these cracks are manifested primarily by distorting and rewriting history, mainly on the right, and by an anti Jews discourse on the left. Although it has unique characteristics, anti-Semitism must not be perceived as a local and domestic challenge for Jewish communities alone, but rather as manifesting a much wider phenomenon of hate speech, hateful discourse, and sometimes even violence. The increasing politicization of anti-Semitism demonstrates the magnitude and influence that basically destructive consequences have for the entire society, Jews and non-Jews alike, and therefore it needs to be recognized as a global concern. So, a little bit over 75 years ago, on August the 6th, 1945, the US unleashed the nuclear age, dropping a single atomic bomb on Hiroshima, which indiscriminately incinerated tens of thousands of children, women, and men in an instant, with the tiny and crude nuclear weapon by today's standard, justified in terms of historic proportion that the bombing ended World War II and saved American lives. Over 90% of the doctors and nurses in Hiroshima were killed and injured by the bomb. 3 days later, the United States dropped a second atomic bomb on Nagasaki. By the end of 1945, more than 210,000 people, mainly civilians, were dead, and the surviving A-bomb victims, Hibakusha, their children and grandchildren, continue to suffer from physical and psychological effects of the bombing. We have also recently marked the 75th anniversary of the United Nations. On January 24, 1946, the United Nations General Assembly adopted the consensus in its very first resolution, which established a commission of the United Nations Security Council to ensure 1. The control of atomic energy to ensure its use only for peaceful purposes, and 2. The elimination from national armaments of atomic weapons and all other major weapons adaptable to mass destruction. Yet in 1951, the Western Shoshone territories were seized by executive order of President Harry Truman to create the Nevada test site, which has become known as the most bombed nation on Earth. The 928 American and 19 British nuclear explosions conducted in Niue, Sokovia between 1951 and 1992 have been classified by the Western Shoshone National Council as bombs rather than tests, because the purpose of a bomb is to destroy, while the idea of a test is to introduce something new. About 1,350 square miles of their total territory, about 43,000 square miles, have been destroyed by hundreds of craters and tunnels, which are de facto uncontrolled underground nuclear waste dumps. Since 1945, there has been over 2,056 nuclear weapon tests by at least 8 countries. Most of these tests have been conducted on the lands of indigenous or colonized people. The United States conducted 1,030 of those tests in the atmosphere, underwater and underground, while the USSR carried out 715 nuclear detonations. Not only did these nuclear test explosions fuel the development and spread of new and more deadly types of nuclear weapons, but hundreds of thousands of people have died and millions more have suffered and continue to suffer from illness directly related to the radioactive fallout from nuclear detonations in the United States, islands in the Pacific, in Australia, the People's Republic of China, Algeria, across Russia, in Kazakhstan, India, Pakistan, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, and elsewhere. A 1990 National Cancer Institute study concluded that fallout from nuclear blasts at the Nevada test site may have caused 10,000 to 75,000 thyroid cancers. There were few, if any, Americans in the contiguous 48 states at the time who were not exposed to some level of fallout. In 1995, the then mayor of Hiroshima, Takashi Hiraoka, described the unimaginable violence of nuclear weapons in testimony before the International Court of Justice in The Hague. The atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki shattered all war precedent. The mind-numbing damage these nuclear weapons wrought shook the foundations of human existence. Beneath the atomic bomb's monstrous mushroom cloud, human skins was burned raw. Crying for water, human beings died in desperate agony. With thoughts of these victims as a starting point, it is incumbent upon us to think about the nuclear age and the relationship between human beings and nuclear weapons. The unique characteristic of the atomic bombing was the enormous destruction that was instantaneous and universal. Old, young, male, female, soldier, civilian, the killing was utterly indiscriminate. The entire city was exposed, and the compound on devastating effects of thermal rays, shock, wave blasts, and radiation. Above all, we must focus on the fact that the human misery caused by the atomic bomb is different from that caused by conventional weapons. Human bodies were burned by the thermal rays and high temperature fires, broken and lacerated by the blast, and insidiously attacked by radiation. These forms of damage compounded and amplified each other. The bomb reduced Hiroshima into an unhuman state utterly beyond human ability to express or imagine. History is written by the victors, thus the heinous massacre that was Hiroshima has been handed down to us as a perfectly justified act of war. It is clear that the use of nuclear weapons, which cause indiscriminate mass murder that leaves survivors for decades, is a violation of international law. The United States is the only nation that has used nuclear weapons in war, has never acknowledged or apologized for the heinous massacre that was Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So where are we now? Withdrawing the United States from the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces, the INF Treaty, followed by Russia, signaled a deepening crisis among the nuclear armed states. Following the 2002 US withdrawal from the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, it imperils the entire structure of arms control and disarmament, including prospects for an extension of the Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty, START. Also, last year, the United States withdrew from violated really the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the JCPOA, deal with Iran and reimposed sanctions on Iran, which is now suffering so severely from the coronavirus pandemic. This is a major blow to the international governance and peace disarmament in the region and the world. I mentioned Iran yesterday. I do not have nothing against Iran. Very great Persian culture. I've even came across President Rouhani during the United Nations General Assembly in 2018. But he was around 10 bodyguards when I was just close to him. So, the United States has not ratified the 1996 Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, one of eight remaining ratifications necessary for the treaty entry into force. Though the Senate voted against ratification in 1999, the US have observed a moratorium on a full scale actually when it comes to nuclear tests since 1992. However, in a very worrying development, it was reported in May that senior officials were discussing resumptions of underground nuclear testing. Mikhail Gorbachev, the former Soviet leader who signed the INF Treaty with Ronald Reagan in 1987, has warned the United States has in effect taken initiative in destroying the entire system of international treaties and accords that served as the underlying foundation for peace and security following World War II. We are living in a time of extraordinary nuclear dangers today because the nuclear threat is an unprecedented moment in human history. The world has never faced so many nuclear flashpoints simultaneously, from NATO Russia tensions to the Korean Peninsula to South Asia and to the South China Sea and Taiwan. All of the nuclear armed states are tangled up in conflicts and crises that could catastrophically escalate at any moment. The risk of nuclear weapons being used again is at its highest since World War II, and most people are calling right now for an urgent issue that the world should take more seriously. Regional conflicts with a nuclear dimension are worsening, and proliferation challenges are not receding. The bulletin of the atomic scientist moved the hands of its iconic doomsday last January. Basically, the doomsday clock to 100 seconds to midnight, the closest it's ever been set since its inception in 1947. Humanity continues to face two simultaneous existential dangers, nuclear war and climate change, that are compounded by a threat multiplier: cyber enabled information warfare that undercuts society's ability to respond. The international security situation is dire, not just because these threats exist, but because world leaders have allowed the international political infrastructure for managing them to erode. Today, nearly 13,500 nuclear weapons, most an order of magnitude more powerful than the US atomic bombs that destroyed Hiroshima and Nagasaki, more than 90% held by the United States, 6,185, and Russia, 6,500, continue to pose an intolerable threat to humanity, and the dangers of war among nuclear armed states are growing. The other nuclear armed states are France, 300, China, 290, the United Kingdom, 215, Pakistan, 150, India, 140, Israel, 80, and North Korea, 25. Iran does not have nuclear weapons. There are some questions regarding South Africa having a dozen that has not been confirmed yet by many sources. The US poised to spend an estimated $1.2 trillion over the next 30 years to maintain and modernize its nuclear bombs, warheads, and delivery systems, and the infrastructure to sustain the nuclear enterprise definitely, and this enormous estimate has already gone up to $1.7 trillion and it's growing. The Nuclear Posture Review carries forward existing plans for the replacement and upgrading of submarine, land, and air-based nuclear forces while adding a new sea-based cruise missile. It also calls for near-term deployments of low-yield warheads on submarine-based missiles, and it describes how nuclear weapons might be used in response to attacks of a non-nuclear nature, including cyber attacks against critical US infrastructure. This anti-disarmament program envisions US reliance on extensive and diversified nuclear forces for decades to come. Mirroring the US stance, Russian President Vladimir Putin in a March 2018 speech boasted about new invincible Russian nuclear weapons and gave a detailed description, complete with video animations, of an array of new nuclear weapons delivery systems including nuclear powered cruise missiles and underwater drones. All of the nuclear armed states are engaged in nuclear weapons in terms of modernization programs right now. That's a trend. United States military spending grew by 5.3% of a total of $732 billion in 2019 and accounted for 38% of global military spending. I was speaking the other day about the military budget in a short video. I wanted to come further more on detail regarding the nuclear part in this video. The Trump administration requested over 740 billion for the military in 2021 proposal, far more than the United States spent for military purposes at the heights of the Korean and Vietnamese wars or the peak of the Reagan buildup in the 1980s. The biggest increase in this budget is a nearly 20% increase in spending on nuclear weapons at $45 billion. Worth noting, according to a recent study, the amount of money spent in 1 year by the US on nuclear weapons could instead provide 300,000 ICU intensive care units, beds, 35,000 ventilators, and 75,000 doctors' salaries, which is an alarming but often overlooked trend in the increased scale and tempo of war games by nuclear armed states and their allies, including nuclear drills, ongoing missile tests, and frequent close encounters between military forces of nuclear armed states, including the US and Russia. The US and China and India and Pakistan exacerbate nuclear dangers. In the early 1980s, the US deployment of cruise and Pershing missiles to Western Europe stoked fears that Europe would serve as the battleground in a US-Soviet nuclear war. It was this fear that mobilized the massive global anti-nuclear movement, leading to negotiation of the INF Treaty. On June 21, 1982, at the conclusion of the United Nations Second Special Session on Disarmament, 1 million people rallied in New York City's Central Park, calling for the elimination of nuclear weapons, and a huge solidarity demonstration took place around the world. That day, many people got arrested and non-violently blocking the gates to the Livermore Nuclear Weapons Laboratory. The Livermore Lab is one of the 2 US laboratories that have designed and developed all US nuclear weapons and continue to do thus. The other is the Los Alamos in New Mexico, the site of the original Manhattan Project. The Livermore Lab is currently developing a refurbished W-80-4 warhead for use in the Air Force's long-range standoff cruise missile, and the W-87-1, a completely new replacement warhead to be paired with an updated recently vehicle and a new ICBM delivery system. Yet, an important and pertinent point that must be mentioned in this context of action. Basically, following the end of the Cold War, nuclear weapons fell off the public's radar screen. It was almost as if the planet itself breathed a huge sigh of relief. People of the world hoped and believed that they had escaped a nuclear holocaust and largely put nuclear weapons out of their minds. Most people believed that the threat of nuclear warhead ended, but it hadn't. Deeply embedded in the US military-industrial complex, military planners and scientists at the nuclear weapons labs conjured up new justifications to sustain the nuclear weapons enterprise. Following the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, the then chair of the United States Joint Chief of Staff was Colin Powell, declared, "We no longer have the luxury of having a specific threat to plan for. What we plan for is we are a superpower. We are the major player of the world stage," he said, "with responsibilities and interests around the world." US national security policy has been remarkably consistent since 1945. Deterrence, the threatened use of nuclear weapons, has been reaffirmed as the cornerstone of US national security by every president since Harry Truman, who oversaw the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Uh, Many other aspects should be mentioned here, including the additional $100 billion by 2020 to modernize the missiles and delivery systems that carry United States nuclear warheads. This huge sum was the price exacted by the US military industrial complex and its representatives in the Hill for Senate ratification of the New START Treaty, the Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty, on December 22nd, 2010. The political conditions attached to Senate ratification in the United States and mirrored by Russia effectively turned START into a disarmament measure. This basically was, in so many words, the result of ratification considered successful in securing commitments from the administration that modernized the nuclear arsenal and support in terms of strategical perspective when it comes to missile defense programs. Two things that would not have happened otherwise. In fact, thanks in part to the contribution of this New START treaty, there has been a lot of involvement when we speak about modernization and missile defense. Paradoxically, this is the same START treaty that has been threatened to scuttle. The resolution of ratification adopted by the United States Senate included commitments to massive investments in the nuclear weapons infrastructure and modernization program, and to continue development of national missile defenses. The United States Senate also successfully obtained assurances that the treaty places no limits on the development and deployment of new kinds of non-nuclear missiles and delivery vehicles with non-ballistic trajectory, including tasks from counterterrorism and industry in this context of action, such as when you speak about the boost glide concepts being explored for prompt global strike. Final ratification of the New START treaty by the Russian Duma was subject of its own reciprocal conditions, including the Russian president's obligation to undertake a program in order to modernize the Russian Federation's strategic nuclear forces. Grounds for the Russian Federation's withdrawal include the unilateral deployment by the United States of missile defense systems and the adoption of strategic non-nuclear prompt global strike weapon systems by the United States without the Russian Federation's approval. These conditions illustrate the complications of what is referred to as strategic stability, the intrinsic relationship between nuclear and conventional weapons. Russia has consistently called indeed for inclusion of strategic stability in nuclear arms control discussions, while the US have categorically refused. At a high conference in Rome in 2009, Mikhail Gorbachev warned that the pursuit of military superiority would be an insurmountable obstacle to ridding the world of nuclear weapons unless discussion of demilitarization was on the table in terms of international politics, the reduction of military budgets, as well as preventing militarization of outer space. Talking about a nuclear-free world will just be rhetorical, according to the former Soviet president. What does deterrence mean in this context of action? The Latin root of deterrence is terror. A typical understanding of Cold War deterrence meant maintaining the capacity to inflict a devastating, retaliatory second strike or mutually assured destruction if either the United States or the Soviet Union attacked the other with nuclear weapons. But what did it really mean, and what does it mean now? Deterrence encompasses the entire military-industrial complex and the national security state and elites that it serves. Not only in the United States, deterrence is an ideology which has outlived the Cold War origins and is used by nuclear weapon states to justify the perpetual possession and threatened use, including first use, of nuclear weapons. Deterrence in post-Cold War U.S. national security doctrine goes well beyond the threat of retaliation, as stated in a September 2008 Department of Defense report on the Air Force nuclear mission, George Bush era. In a January 2010 Wall Street Journal op-ed entitled How to Protect Our Nuclear Deterrent, the Four Horsemen, George Shultz, William Perry, Henry Kissinger, and Sam Nunn declared maintaining high confidence in our nuclear arsenal is critical. As the numbers of these weapons goes down, the United States must continue to attract, develop, and retain the outstanding scientists, engineers, designers, and technicians we will need to maintain our nuclear arsenal, whatever its size, for as long as the nation's security requires it. And they warned the deadliest weapons ever invented could fall into the dangerous hands, calling for a substantial increase in funding for the United States nuclear weapons laboratories and a modernized nuclear weapons infrastructure in order to prevent this from happening. The Four Horsemen's analysis and recommendation were endorsed by then Vice President Joe Biden 10 days later in a Wall Street Journal op-ed announcing the administration's inflated budget request. Unfortunately, this circular reasoning is very short-sighted. Investing in a modernized nuclear weapons infrastructure will be viewed as hypocritical by other nations, and as we are seeing now, it will provide the presidents the means to design and build new nuclear weapons if they so choose, and to spark new arms races, and that's the real problem. In their op-ed, the Four Horsemen invoked the specter of nuclear weapons falling into dangerous hands 3 times. Yet, in whose hands are nuclear weapons safe? The only hands that have so far used them. As the Hans Blix-led WMD Commission stated in its 2006 reports, Weapons of Terror, Freeing the World of Nuclear, Biological, and Chemical Acts, the Commission rejects the suggestion that nuclear weapons in the hands of some pose no threat, while in the hands of others they place the world in mortal jeopardy. As they wisely observed, governments possessing nuclear weapons can act responsibly or recklessly. Governments may also change over time. In short, nuclear weapons are dangerous in anyone's hands. The policy of nuclear deterrence is not passive and it's not benign. On July the 7th, 2017, the UN witnessed the adoption by the majority of the world's countries of a historical treaty to prohibit the possession, development, testing, use, and threat of use of nuclear weapons. The vote by 122 to 1 unambiguously demonstrates by one measure that most of the world has indeed come to its sense regarding nuclear weapons. The Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, the TPNW, opened for a new signature at the United Nations headquarters in New York. One of the strengths of the banned treaty is its focus on the humanitarian impacts of nuclear weapons and the clear recognition during the negotiation that there could be no adequate response to any use of nuclear weapons. From the preamble, we can say cognizant that the catastrophic consequences of nuclear weapons cannot be adequately addressed, transcend national borders, pose grave implications for human survival, the environment, socioeconomic development, the global economy, food security, and the health of current and future generations. This comes into sharp focus as we experience the unfolding reality of governments and public health systems completely unprepared to respond to the coronavirus pandemic and looming at the same time global economic collapse. But we stand at a nuclear crossroads in a sharply divided world. While the TPNW represents the total repudiation of nuclear weapons by most of the states that don't possess them, the United States and the 8 other countries, armed states, boycotted the negotiations along with Japan, Australia, the Republic of Korea, and all but one of the 28 NATO member states. All countries under the United States nuclear umbrella. We could understand the conjuncture and the condition of every country in this context of action. So, in a joint statement to get back following the vote, the United States, France, and the United Kingdom declared, "We do not intend to sign, ratify, or ever become party to the treaty." We must note that the majority of the world's population lives in nuclear armed countries or countries under the United States nuclear umbrella. These are also the world's largest economies. Previously, the United States condemned the TPNW in the General Assembly, advocating of a ban treaty, say it is open for all, but how can a state that relies on nuclear weapons for its security possibly join a negotiation meant to stigmatize and eliminate them? To get back to the 1970 Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, the NPT, representing the only binding commitment in a multilateral treaty to the goal of disarmament by the five original nuclear armed states, the US, the UK, the USSR, Russia today, France, and the People's Republic of China. Article 6 spells out the disarmament obligation. Each of the parties to the treaty undertakes to pursue negotiations in good faith on effective measures relating to cessation of the nuclear arms race at an early date and to nuclear disarmament, and on a treaty on general and complete disarmament under strict and effective international control. The NPT's disarmament obligations enshrined in the preamble and Article 6 have been reiterated and reinforced by agreements made in connection with the 1995 extension decisions, the 2000 and 2010 review conferences, and the International Court of Justice 1996 advisory opinion, which provided the authoritative interpretation of Article 6. The court found unanimously there exists an obligation to pursue in good faith and bring to a conclusion negotiation leading to nuclear disarmament in all its aspects under strict and effective international control. The principles and objectives on non-proliferation and disarmament adopted in connection with the 1995 NPT extension decision, the 13 practical steps for the systemic progressive efforts to implement Article 6 of the Treaty of the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons, including an unequivocal undertaking by the nuclear weapon states to accomplish the total elimination of their nuclear arsenals, leading to nuclear disarmament, to which all states parties are committed under Article 6. Adopted by the 2000 Review Conference and the 64 Points Action Plan, which includes concrete steps for the total elimination of nuclear weapons. Adopted the conclusion of the 2010 Review Conference, created expectation as well on the part of the non-nuclear weapons state parties, 184 countries that have foresawn nuclear weapons, that nuclear disarmament was a work in progress. However, the failure of the nuclear armed state to make good on their disarmament obligation, and to the contrary, in the face of new arms racing, the long-term viability of the NPT is being questioned by some. Changes, both bad or good, are happening incredibly fast, and there is a new openness to critically examining the US history of racism and violence. Now is a good time to take a critical look at the official US justification that the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki were necessary to end the war and save American lives. In this time of national reckoning, we are called to examine basically the several aspects of this decision of using the atomic bombs in the world. It is imperative for us to question the nature of state of violence and national priorities amid another context of socioeconomic chaos, past and present. We must move from the irrational fear-based ideology of deterrence to the rational fear of an eventual nuclear weapon use while using a sustainable thinking process, whether by accident or design by some nuclear weapon processing state that places the threatened use of nuclear weapons. The eventual nuclear weapon use must be at the core of the national security policy. There is also a need to stimulate a rational hope vis-à-vis security that can be redefined in humanitarian and ecologically sustainable terms that will lead to the elimination of nuclear weapons and dramatic demilitarization, freeing up therefore tremendous resources desperately needed up to address universal human needs. We are in a brave new world, in the midst of turbulence, uncertainties. It is difficult to predict how progress on the elimination of nuclear weapons, much less efforts to restore modest arms control measures, can succeed. So this was basically the point regarding the matter of the enduring nuclear threat that concludes my analysis of this topic that I have been speaking about throughout several videos. Among the next conferences, video conferences, I will be following up. We have the one on vulnerable targets, that is today and tomorrow, convened by the UNICT and Qatar at the United Nations. Speaking here also about sport events ahead of the counterterrorism strategy at the 2022 FIFA Soccer World Cup, led by the efforts of cooperation of His Majesty King Mohammed VI and the Kingdom of Morocco that works with Qatar in this context of action of counterterrorism for the worldwide sport events. Since I invoked sports, I want to get back maybe to the fact that the Euro, the UEFA Euro 2020 and Copa America right now are a prelude of big events for the COVID era. But when it comes to the Olympic Games, besides the counterterrorism management I'm invoking, the emergency management regarding COVID, I think it's very difficult for the Olympics in Tokyo right now because it's not like soccer. Soccer are really been used to the getting accustomed to the pandemic since May 2020, since the South Korean League and the German Bundesliga resumed at that time. We have so many disciplines in the Olympic Games, not just soccer. And the real question challenge, are we able to host all of them amid the COVID-19 times? This is a question also for the organizer of the Beijing Winter Olympics next winter. Getting back to the other conferences, I will wrap up the synthesis of the one organized by Mexico and the Republic of Korea related to the statistics of criminal justice later this month. I spoke the other day about the endeavors of the Republic of Korea in this matter. While invoking that topic, let me just clarify that the Praxis translation of Korean in the United States directly translate the Republic of Korea ROK to Korea, not South Korea. Meanwhile, it translates from Korean to English the Democratic People's Republic of Korea to North Korea, invoking the North Korea in this case, while in South Korea they call it Korea. If we get back to the Korean Peninsula and focusing here on the official names, the Republic of Korea or South Korea is called Hanguk. Meanwhile, the DPRK or North Korea is called Chosun. That's how they refer to themselves. Knowing that in the ideology of North Korea, Chosun refers to the Joseon dynasty, which was an ancient dynasty that ruled over all the Korean peninsula, from which comes this ideology that technically Chosun is Korea and Hanguk is an imaginary myth that has existed ever since the end of the Second World War and the question that have been discussed during the Korean War as well. The thing I want to speak about here, since I spoke before about movies, about sports, big fan of history, so always related to movies, but here I want to speak about the real story of the last samurai, what happened real. It was related to Jules Brunet, who was a graduate from l'École Polytechnique in France in 1857, where he specialized in artillery. And from 1862 to 1867, he participated in the French intervention in Mexico under Napoleon III, getting him the Légion d'honneur. He arrived in Yokohama in 1865 as a member of the first military mission of France to Japan. He had to form an elite corps of the shogun Tokugawa Yoshinobu. He developed a fascination for Japanese culture and tradition. Within a period of political turmoil, leading in early 1866 Meiji Emperor Hirko coming to power, which belonged to the shogun since 600 years. The civil war started amid the non-support of the emperor by the shogun, and then we had the Boshin War, opposing the imperial faction favorable to the opening of Japan and shogunal faction favorite to Sakoku, which is isolation. Léon Roche, the French ambassador to Japan back then, warned the emperor about tactical mistake that will lead later to defeats the Battle of Kosha Katsunama. Shogun troops, including Brunet's students, refused to abdicate. Led by Admiral Enomoto Takayaki, they retreated towards north. Back in France, Napoleon III signed a treaty that strictly entered France in neutrality agreement in the conflicts and ordered the mission to come back to France. This is where Brunet and some of his students choose to stay in Japan, joining Takayaki and Hokkaido in the hope to counterattack. So Brunet used the Vauban-style place as the center of rebel forces, helping to form the Republic of Esso on December 15th, 1868, which president became Enomoto Takayaki. In March 1869, 10,000 soldiers landed in Hokkaido from the Imperial Army. Brunet put an epic resistance in May 1869. The Meiji era started over in the whole land of Japan ever since then. The plot of Homura was twisted in the Hollywood movies that is called The Last Samurai.